Okay, welcome back to part 3 of the exchange rate and balance of payments narrative PowerPoints, and this is picking up on the booklet page which is headed up effects of a rise in the value of a currency. Okay, so in this instance we've got a situation where in year one the value of the pound is worth $1.50. Okay. However, by the second year, in year 2, that's been strengthened. So the value of the pound has been strengthened. It's appreciated, and it's risen to £2. Okay. And remembering that spiced acronym, which is stronger pound, imports cheaper, exports dearer. Let's see how that has an effect on a certain situation then. Okay. So our export prices in year 1 were $15, and in year 2 they would be $20. Okay. However, our import prices would be slightly different, where effectively we've got £30 for year 1, and in year 2 the value has gone down to £22.50. Okay, so effectively our export price in year 1 would have been £15. So if the good was priced at £10, okay, in year 1, the value of that good as an export cost would be $15, but because of this appreciation in the value of the pound, that would mean that in year 2, the value for that consumer would be, for a US consumer, would be $20 to buy. Okay. However, in the import situation, where we've got our import price of a US good priced at $45, in year 1 that would only cost us, that would cost us £30. But in year 2, because of this increased appreciation in the value of the pound, then that has fallen to £22.50. Okay. So if we take a look at our little piece of prose there, then in terms of what how you might actually describe that. So if we take, in the first instance, we've got a rise in the value of the currency. Is that then going to cause the fall in the price of imports and a rise in the price of exports? Okay. Now, obviously, the extent to which that's going to change is going to have a bit of an impact. But in the first instance, if certain conditions were available and all other things were equal, you'd expect that to lead to a fall in the demand for exports and a rise in the demand for imports, clearly, because the whole principle is spiced. You've got imports that are essentially cheaper and exports that are dearer and more expensive. Okay. However, the extent to which that change in demand is going to happen is going to depend on the price elasticity of demand. Okay, so if we've got goods that are elastic in demand, then that's going to have a fundamental impact. But if we've got inelastic demand, so price is essentially demand doesn't change depending on the price change, that clearly is not going to have a huge impact with those changes. Okay, so let's take a look then at some of the things that we can assume, or not so much assume, but look at the effect that might a rise in the value of the pound would have on, first and foremost, the current account deficit. Okay, so we've looked at, or we're looking in this instance at the current account deficit, economic growth, unemployment, and inflation. So 4 of the key macroeconomic objectives that the government might have, or an economy might have. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to have a go at that, have a look at it, have a think about it without looking at the answers that are on screen at present, but fundamentally spend some time taking a look at that, and we'll come back and talk about these options in a minute. So have a go first, and then we'll come back and we'll talk through the options. Okay. So first and foremost, then, if we're looking at the rise in the value of the pound, how is that going to affect the current account deficit? Well, in the first instance, it's going to make it worse because effectively the price of imports fall. That's going to mean that we're going to be looking to import more. Okay, and if the price of exports rise, then essentially that's going to mean that we've got less demand for those products and services. Okay, well, bearing in mind that whole principle, if we're talking about economic growth, and remember the way in which we calculate aggregate demand, in essence, if we've got net trade at a lower level, if we've got lower export demand and greater expenditure on imports, you would expect domestic AD, aggregate demand, to be lower, and that's obviously going to cause lower levels of economic growth. So that's clearly not a great thing for economic growth as such. Okay. Now, if we then take that principle and then apply that to unemployment, clearly, if we've got lower levels of economic growth, that's going to mean there's going to be less demand for workers, and that's going to mean, as a result, because of that lower demand for goods and services, that could mean that we're going to get higher levels of unemployment. Firms may choose to cut their workforce to suit the amount of demand that's available out there for their goods and services. Okay, so unemployment in that situation would be a bit of an issue. However, on the flip side of that, one could argue that that could also actually reduce inflation. Okay, so if we've got an appreciation in the value of the pound, the reason why inflation is likely to be lower is that import prices are going to become cheaper. Okay, now given how much we import as a country, then the cost of imported goods and raw materials is going to fall after an appreciation. So if we think about the amount of oil that we import as a country, the imported oil price would fall, leading to cheaper petrol prices. Okay, we're going to have lower levels of aggregate demand based on what we talked about, and that's probably as a result going to lead to lower levels of demand, pull inflation, and obviously as exports are more expensive, manufacturers have greater incentives to try and cut costs and to try and remain competitive. Okay, so each one of those things, each one of those macroeconomic objective aims is going to be somewhat affected by a change in the value of the pound, in this case a rise in the value of the pound. Okay, so quite a few implications for a change in the value of the currency and the effect that it might have on current account deficit, economic growth, unemployment and inflation. Okay, so bearing that in mind, what I'd like you to do is take a look on the next page in your booklets, and there is a table that I'd like you to have a go at completing. Okay, so effectively it's the title is Effects of a Fall in the Value of the Pound. Okay, and there are 8 scenarios that I'd like to take a look at, and it's a case of winners and losers, who gains and who loses from a fall in the external value of sterling. Okay, so in this case we've got a weaker pound. Okay, so remember Whippy weak pound, imports dearer, exports cheaper. So in this instance, bearing that in mind, you've got to think about who is going to be a winner and a loser, and also possibly make some sort of evaluative comment about that too. So the first example is an equipment manufacturer. Komatsu manufactures construction and mining equipment in the UK, much of which is exported to Eurozone countries. So let's take a look at that one together, and then I'm going to stop and let you have a look at the other examples, and then we'll work through them together. Okay, so in this instance, the equipment manufacturer is going to be a winner. The reason is that if we've got a weaker level of sterling, that's going to make exports cheaper. in this instance, the manufacturer is based in the UK and is selling into the Eurozone, and so as a result of that, it should lead to them being more price competitive, and that should then lead to increased sales. Okay. Imports also are going to become more expensive, and it might make domestically produced goods more attractive to consumers. So the equipment manufacturer in this instance should be a winner. Okay, so that's the first one. So I'd like you to have a go at 2 down to 8. Turn the PowerPoint off, have a go at that yourselves, and then we'll come back and talk through the different options from 2 through to 8. Okay. Okay, so second example then, tourism. Okay, so tourism is going to be a winner. Hotels in London and Winchester, and the reason for that is that effectively it's better value from people from abroad and higher costs. Okay, so that effectively means that if we've got a fall in the value of sterling, people basically are going to get cheaper holidays, and they're going to come over to us as opposed to staying at home. Okay, next one then, glass manufacturer. In this situation, NJ Bradford is a UK business which supplies glass across a number of industries. Their main competitors come from China, offering cheap glass products. So in this instance, a weak pound is going to be a good thing because imports are going to become more expensive, and so NJ Bradford should become more price competitive against their Chinese competitor. So that should mean, as a result of that, consumers are more likely to buy from domestically produced goods or from domestically produced suppliers, and that's going to increase the level of sales for NJ Bradford. So happy days for the glass manufacturer. What about a UK airline then? It buys most of its fuel from international petrol markets and pays in US dollars. Now, if we've got a weaker pound, that's clearly not going to be a good thing, is it? Okay, because the airline is going to need to buy dollars, and it will get less of the dollars for its pound because we've got a weaker currency as a result. So the airline industry is a loser again, I'm afraid. Not having a very good time of it just of late, are they? Next thing then, estate agents selling prime London property. Okay, many of their clients are investors from abroad, so they are going to be a winner simply because we've got a weaker pound that's made property in prime central London even more enticing to foreign investors seeking safe havens, and also will continue to do so. So in this instance, that was just an example of the 2018 review that Knight Frank, a big London estate agency, carried out. City of London. So in this instance, banks in the city bill many of their customers in US dollars and euros, but pay costs in sterling. So clearly in that situation, if the bank is holding dollars which it now buys for more pounds, that's clearly going to be a good thing. Okay, that's effectively, if you think about that, just break it down for a minute. If we bill many of our customers in US dollars and euros but pay our costs in sterling because the value of our sterling has fallen, it's going to cost us less, isn't it? Okay, what about people living in France and Spain on sterling pensions? They're going to be losers, aren't they? Because if the euro was worth roughly in 2007 68p, then in that case, that at that time, that would have meant for every £100 they would expect to receive 147 euros. However, after the credit crunch, the euro increased in value against the pound, and that meant that instead of for every £100 I'm getting 147 euros, they're only receiving 110 euros. So a 25% devaluation in just 3 years. So that's clearly going to have an effect, a fairly bad effect on people living in France and Spain on sterling pensions. Okay, bondholders, foreign investors holding UK government bonds, they're going to be losers, aren't they? Because if you convert your asset back into into dollars, then you're clearly going to get less. Okay, so those people that are foreign investors holding UK government bonds, given that the value of the pound has fallen, that clearly is going to mean that as a result of that, you're going to get less when you convert back. Okay, so let's take a look at the next scenario then. So in this instance, we're talking about an effective change in the exchange rate. Okay, so we've got a few scenarios here. So in this instance, we've got an exchange rate of £1 to €3, and we've got to assume there are no costs of trading with France. Okay, so how much would a Jaguar cost in France if it's built in the UK and cost £20,000 in the UK? So let's look at this one together, and then you can have a go at the other ones, and we'll come back and have a chat about those in a minute. So first and foremost, okay, in this instance, because we've got the exchange rate at £1 per €3, in this instance, if Jaguars cost £20,000 to build in the UK, it's going to basically cost €60,000 to buy in France. So that's basically calculated by the original cost at £20,000 times by, in this case, the €3 per pound. That's the exchange rate. So €60,000 is what it would cost us to buy that Jaguar in France. Okay. What about the next one then? How much will the Renault cost if in the UK if it's built in France and costs €30,000 in France? I want you to have a go at that, and you can see a little bit further down there are some changes in those values, and so in this instance we need to see how that affects trade, and you can see it makes some considerable differences. And obviously, if exchange rates are fluctuating a large amount, that can have quite a big impact on the international import-export traders and businesses that rely heavily on other markets outside of the UK for their trade. So stop the PowerPoint there, have a go at completing them, and then we'll come back and discuss those together. Okay, so let's have a look at the Renault then. So in this instance, €30,000 in France. It's cost €30,000 to build, based on our situation where we've got an exchange rate of £1 to €3. That's basically going to cost us £10,000 to buy. Sorry, it's going to cost £10,000 to build, based on the change in exchange rate. Next one then, let's look at this change then. So if we've got the Jaguar at £20,000 in the build being built in the UK, and cost £20,000 in the UK, with this change in the level of exchange rate, we've now got a significant change. Okay, so it's cost €40,000 to build now, as opposed to £60,000. And in this instance again, we've got a change where if the Renault cost in the UK, what would it cost in the UK if it was built in France at €30,000? It's gone up significantly in this instance to £15,000. So what can we conclude from that? Well, clearly, as like I mentioned, the exchange rate is a very important factor in the competitiveness of a country's products and services between domestic and overseas markets. So clearly, that's something that any business, any firm would have to bear in mind, because it can have a big impact on those changes on the value of imports and exports. Okay, so let's have a look at more changes, more effects on the change in the exchange rate. Okay, so let's have a look at the effect that it might have on the current account, and that's very much going to depend on the price elasticity of demand for imports and exports. Okay, so what I'd like you to do again, have a go at completing those questions, defining the price elasticity of demand and show how it's calculated. Why might the demand for imports and exports be inelastic in the short run? And why might the demand for imports and exports be elastic in the long run? So, given what you know about the price elasticity and the work that you've done in theme 1, I'd want you to see how that might have an impact on this scenario. Okay, so again, stop the PowerPoint, have a go at completing those 3 questions, and then we'll come back and talk through the options from there. Okay, so let's have a look first and foremost then at defining the price elasticity of demand and showing how it's calculated. Okay, so if we're going to define it, the responsiveness of the quantity demanded to a change in price. That's a pretty good, solid definition of price elasticity of demand. How is it calculated? It's basically the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. That's the way in which you calculate it. Okay. Why might the demand for imports and exports be inelastic in the short run? Let's take a look at why that might be. First and foremost, firms can't change suppliers in the short run as they will have agreed contracts. So to some degree, in the short term, even though you might find those changes, those exchange rates changing, if you've got a long-term contract with somebody, then clearly you're not going to be able to just change the value of those contracts based on exchange rate fluctuations. Okay. Also, we've got to bear in mind that the consumers will take some time to adapt and find alternatives. So you're not going to find necessarily a substitution purchase happening straight away. But clearly, in the short term, that's going to be a fairly difficult thing to do. But let's have a look and see why in the long run, why imports and exports might be more, the demand might be more elastic. Well, 2 things really. One, clearly firms can change to cheaper suppliers or perhaps domestic suppliers or supplies, and also consumers in the longer run will have a chance to look for alternative brands and products. So chances are that in the longer run, then you're going to find that imports and exports are likely to be more elastic. Demand for imports and exports are going to be more elastic as a result of that. Okie dokie. Let's have a look then at, in this situation, taking this a slight stage further, where we're looking at the effect of export revenue in the short run. Okay, so we've got that same scenario where we've got the exchange rate as a pound to €3, and in this instance we've got the Jaguar is producing cars that cost £20,000 and they would cost €60,000 in France. Okay, if we got 100 exported cars to France, our export revenue in pounds is going to be effectively 100 times by, in this case, £20,000. Okay, this is in export in pounds, so our total revenue is going to be £2 million. However, if we then look at how that change, if we've got this change in value, the exchange rate for the pound has moved from €3 to €2, that means our pound has depreciated. So in this instance then, let's take a look and see how that might affect export revenue in the short run. Okay, in this situation, we've got a change in the value of the pound, but also a change in the amount of cars that are being exported. Okay, so Jaguar originally costing £20,000 to produce, is now being sold in France at €40,000. So in this instance, if we've got a change, in this instance, because obviously the price has fallen, we've got a higher level of demand for Jaguars in France. So we've got 120 being demanded as opposed to the original 100. In this instance, we've got, although the value of the pound has dropped, in terms of the total revenue that we've generated £2,400,000 because we've obviously got the extra 20 exported cars. Okay, so if we then try and calculate the price elasticity of demand, if the price falls from 60,000 to 40,000 euros and the demand rises from 100 to 120, there are a couple of calculations we need to include. Okay, the first one is obviously the quantity demanded change. Okay, so effectively we've got to try and calculate the percentage change in quantity demanded. So we've got, in this instance, we've got 20 more divided by the original 100 times by 100, okay, in order to get that percentage change, okay. But then in terms of our price change, we've got essentially 20,000 change against the original 60,000 times by 100. So that effectively is giving us 20% change in quantity demanded, divided by a 33% fall in the price. So in this instance, we've got relatively inelastic demand. So relatively so the demand is relatively insensitive to price change. Okay, so quite a big price change, but actually our percentage change in quantity demanded hasn't changed significantly. Okay, let's take a look at export revenue in the long run then. So in this instance, we've got an increase to 500 in the long run. The export revenue in pounds at this point is going to give us £10 million. Okay. However, if we then take a look and see what the price elasticity of demand is if the price falls from 60 to 40,000 euros and our demand rises from 100 to 500, a significant increase, isn't it? Okay. In this instance, we would have a quantity demand change is 400 divided by the original 100 times by 100, and then the price change is, in this instance, minus 20,000, so falling 20,000 against the original 60,000 times by 100. Okay, so in this instance, we got a 400% change in the quantity demanded, but we've got a price change of 33% in terms of the overall percentage change. Okay, so in this instance, price elasticity is very responsive or demand is very responsive to price change. Okay, so in this instance, what is the relationship between PED for exports and export revenue then? Okay, well, if PED is elastic, then export revenues will rise in the long run. Okay, and that does make some sense, doesn't it? So if we've got elastic demand and we've got these scenarios changing like it's shown here, then that's clearly going to have a big impact in the long run. Okay, let's take a look at the next scenario then. So we've done a couple of examples where we've looked at different situations. And now we're going to look at effectively the effect of import expenditure on import expenditure in the short run. Okay, so if Renault is to produce in France at 30,000 euros, it would cost £10,000 in the UK, based on that original figure there, that the pound being worth €3. Okay. In this instance, if we've got 500 cars that are imported to France, the total expenditure in pounds is going to be £5 million. So that's the 500 times by the 10,000. Okay, but if we've got this change where we've got the value of the pound depreciating against the euro, that is going to make a significant change. Okay, so in this instance, Renault is now producing in France. It's cost €30,000, but it would cost 15,000 in the UK to buy. Okay, so in this instance, suppose the number of Renaults imported falls from 400, falls to 400 in the short run. What's the expenditure on imports in pounds? So 400 times by 15,000, giving 6 million. And in this instance, calculating the price elasticity of demand, this process is where we've got essentially the quantity demanded falling by 100, and the price changing by a significant amount, as you can see. So in this instance, we've got a price change of above 50%, and the quantity change of just 20%. So relatively speaking, we've got inelastic demand. So demand's not particularly responsive to price change in the short term. Let's take a look at this last scenario, where we've got imports, effects of imports on expenditure in the long run then. Okay, so in this instance, if we've got the number of Renaults imported from France falling to just 100, the import expenditure is going to be 15,000 times 100, so £1.5 million. Okay, and the change in demand, the level of change in demand, so a fall of 400, as opposed to the original 500, and in this instance we've got a PED of minus 1.6. Okay, so in this instance, if we've got PED that's elastic, then import costs will reduce in the long run. Okay, so what I'd like you to do next is to take a look at the next page in your booklet, which is a question and answer article on exchange rates, and it's quite a useful piece of guidance on tackling exam questions in economics, specifically when we're talking about exchange rates. So it's quite a nice example that I'd like you to take a look at it. It's going to take a little while to read through, and it also just takes you step by step through the process that you should consider. I think you should find that really quite useful. By all means, highlight, do whatever you need to do on the document to, or maybe annotate or highlight, so that you've got some reference for that. But you should find that a really useful activity and article to take a view on. It's been written by an economist from Charter School, so have a look at that, and then we'll move on from there.